Hello, everyone. So we are live. Good afternoon, good evening to everyone who is participating on MobLab Live 2, Confronting Authoritarianism, Understanding and Creating Resistance. We are very happy to have you. We are very sorry that for the delay in the broadcast, we were facing some technical issues, and thank you for holding on to this. Yeah, so we have very exciting bunch of speakers with us. I would share the detail with you. We have Vanessa again, who would be hosting and moderating the show with us. As you know, she's the author of Read My Lips, Why Americans Are Proud to Pay Taxes, and co-author of Tea Party and Remaking of Republic Conservatism. We have Dr. Maria Stephan with us. She directs the program of Nonviolent Action at U.S. Institute of Peace, and which focuses on applied research, training, and education, informing policies and practice to civil resistance. She has also co-authored Why Civil Resistance Works, The Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Conflict, co-edited Is Authoritarianism Staging a Comeback, and edited Civilian Jihad, Nonviolent Struggle, Democratization, and Governance in the Middle East. Welcome, Maria. We also have Steve Levitsky. Professor Levitsky's research interest includes political parties, authoritarianism, and democratization, and weak and informal institutions with a focus on Latin America. He's the author of Transforming Labor-Based Parties in Latin America, Argentine Peronism in the Comparative Perspective, co-author of Competitive Authoritarianism, Hybrid Regimes After the Cold War, and co-editor of Argentine Democracy, the Politics of Institutional Weakness, Informal Institutions and Democracy, Lessons from Latin America. Welcome, Steve. We also have another speaker who will join us shortly. Because of the tech issues, there's a delay. But we have Vitali, who's a Russian-based political strategist who has more than 12 years of experience in designing and evaluating campaigns based on US, American, Russian, European. And he has also worked with Obama's elections in 2012 and served as mobilization director for the state of Nevada with Bernie Sanders' campaign in 2016. He's currently focusing his work on reforming the Russian politics and advising liberal candidates in opposition to President Vladimir Putin. I welcome him virtually as soon as he joins the call. Over to you, Vanessa, to kickstart the discussion.
Thank you, Aprajita. So yes, I just want to start by thanking our guests for joining us today. And just to add my sort of 2 cents, Stephen Levitsky is a professor of government at Harvard University. He's also one of the foremost scholars in the world on authoritarianism and democratization. And Maria Stephan has done what is genuinely groundbreaking work on nonviolent civil resistance. And her work has really, I think, changed how people think about democracy movements. So I'm super excited to talk to you guys today. I think I want to start, Steve, by talking about your new book, which has the attention-grabbing title of How Democracies Die. And if you don't mind, why don't you just tell us a little bit about it? How do democracies die? And has that we know about democratization changed in recent years?
Those are two different questions. Let me start with how democracies die. The sort of liftoff point for the book is that democracies die today in ways that are very different from in the past. In the bad old days, or maybe the good old days, certainly in the Cold War, democracies were most likely to die by military coup, by the men with guns seizing power from elected leaders, often with a fair amount of violence. The Pinochet's coup in Chile, in which the presidential palace was bombed from the air and the president was killed in the presidential palace and gave way to a military junta, is sort of a classic type of old-style democratic death. And today it's much more likely that democracy dies at the hands of elected leaders, that elected leaders themselves, often slowly, often subtly, often even in the eyes of citizens imperceptibly, different in a way that it's so subtle that it's difficult to see, but die beginning at the ballot box rather than in the military barracks. So now a vast majority of democratic deaths since 1990 have been at the hands of elected leaders.
So I know that a lot of the book focuses on the case of the United States. I think we in the United States have perhaps been a little bit overconfident about democratic stability at home. You want to talk a little bit about that aspect of the book?
Sure. I mean, we have good reason to be overconfident in a sense, right? No country even remotely as rich as the United States has ever suffered a democratic breakdown. So there's sort of good statistical reasons, good historical reasons to think that U.S. democracy should survive. And I should state, I don't think that U.S. democracy has died. But where we think people are sometimes overconfident is in our Constitution, that the written down rules, what the American founders designed in the late 18th century is a nice Constitution, but that in and of itself, and I think this is an important warning for Democrats all over the world, the written Constitution itself is only worth so much. And what's really of fundamental importance is the informal norms that underlie and sustain those formal constitutional rules. And what Daniel Ziblatt and I argue is that in the United States in the last 20 or 30 years, those democratic norms have been eroding. And that makes our formal institutions much weaker.
So,
not dead, but weaker.
Not dead yet, but weaker. Maria, were you jumping in on that? Did you want to add something?
No, except that, one of my favorite quotes from a renowned federal judge, Learned Hand, he said, "Liberty lies in the hearts of men and women. And when it dies, no constitution, no law, no court can save it. No constitution, no law, no court can even do much at all to save it." So I think Steve's spot on that in general, you have to address the habits of democracy and the attitudes of democracy, which contribute very much to the institutions and the formalities. So you don't want to lose those things.
I want to come back to the idea of habits of democracy, but first, on some level, I find it just so difficult to think about how a country can repeatedly have elections and not be a democracy, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, but obviously we have many examples of that. So Steve, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how, from an academic perspective, we think about what counts as democracy, what counts as authoritarianism, and what's that sort of middle category, which I know you've talked about as competitive authoritarianism.
Sure. It used to be simpler in the old days when, particularly during the Cold War period or during the 1920s and 30s, especially the 1930s, where authoritarian regimes looked like authoritarian regimes. They were single-party regimes. Opposition was outlawed. There were no multi-party elections, and so it was very easy to call an authoritarian regime authoritarian. Particularly with the end of the Cold War, the last 30 years or so, most countries in the world hold multi-party elections. And I think a lot of us, particularly the media, have been fooled into thinking, oh, they hold multi-party elections, they must be democracies. And very often they're not. Simply holding elections, simply allowing an opposition, doesn't make a country a democracy. If competition is not remotely fair, if conditions are not such that the opposition can compete in a reasonable way against the incumbents, I would argue you don't have a democracy. So a democracy requires a reasonably level playing field between the government and the opposition. That kind of playing field does not exist today in Russia, for example. Doesn't exist today in Venezuela. Did not exist throughout most of 20th century Mexico. In Mexico, under the PRI, they always had elections. They had regular elections every 6 years. But the PRI always won, and that wasn't just a coincidence. That wasn't just good campaigning by the PRI. The playing field was tilted in favor of the government. That's not a democracy.
So two things. I think first of all, I want to ask if Vitali could maybe mute his mic because I think we're getting some feedback. At least that's what I'm seeing over here on my computer. But actually, I want to turn to Vitali because we just sort of come up on the topic that is very relevant to his own work, right? So Vitali has worked on a number of election campaigns in very different circumstances. The range of circumstances genuinely surprised me very much when I was looking into his campaign bio. So Vitali has worked on campaigns like President Obama's 2012 campaign, and also Bernie Sanders' 2016 campaign, and also Angela Merkel's campaign in Germany. And also he's now working on the municipal elections in Moscow. And I think he's involved in the presidential elections there as well. And so the idea that there are campaign skills or tactics that you can transfer from well, I mean, you know, not to say that our democratic context here is perfect, but from a democratic country to an authoritarian one is fascinating, and I think it might really provide some leverage for people who are in contexts that are authoritarian but have this electoral system. Vitali, do you want to jump in for a moment and talk a little bit about your work, and then I'll sort of follow up with some specific questions?
Sure. Can you guys hear me? Can you see me? We had some troubles
Yep.
to get online.
You're doing great.
Oh, great. I apologize. I apologize because I'm on a jump to catch the next flight. So I'm probably gonna have just 10-15 minutes, but it's really I believe it's enough to just go briefly over what's happening in Russia and how this last campaigns or what they taught me that I would love to share with you guys. So as you said correctly, we just finished a couple of weeks ago a huge campaign that I labeled as a first political Uber, or the first political incubator, to be precise, where we tried to change the politics, not from a point of view of political agenda, not from point of view of campaign, but generally to try to create a totally different political environment, basically to change the paradigm of politics. So now, let me explain what I mean by that, and why did I label it first political Uber. So, as you all know, Uber changed quite a lot the way we use the taxi or travel, or in the meantime, order food. So, previously, we had a lot of like big or small taxi companies in every country, a different one. We had a lot of I don't know, like regulations by government, but then a company arose that was called Uber and created technology where everybody can basically take a cab really easily. You don't need cash anymore. If you lose your wallet, you still can get a cab. You don't need anything. You just hit the button and the taxi is there. You don't need to call in, and you don't need to know the number if you're abroad. And there was a big shift and change in the paradigm of and usability, first of all. Moreover, it changed the way people work. Like previously, you had to become a taxi driver. You had to go to particular course or like classes, learn a lot of streets by heart, like 300-400 streets in downtown Manhattan, for example. You had to know by heart, do a lot of tests. It was complicated. Now you have to buy a license. Now you just have a phone, you have a car, you're willing to work. There you go. You can be a driver. So that led to the rise of quality, the changing of behavioral of people and the way we use the taxi now. And so it's a classical win-win situation. Now, if you think of music industry, that was the same. Previously, you had to buy the whole album in order to get a song that you like, or for a musician without any label or major label and tons of money, you had no opportunity to get published. Now everybody.
So Vitali, so tell me how you use that model in Russia.
I'm getting there. I'm sorry. I'm getting there. So and I was always wondering. I said, like, why in technology in the industry in a business, everything works, and you have KPIs, you have business metrics, you can measure the success of your business. And it seems like politics is still like Windows 95, like staying in the 20th century while we live in 21st century. So, and while working in the Obama campaign, I realized Obama made campaigning or political process really sexy and cool. And senators made it like to a big festival, like a Woodstock festival or a big concert, because so many people came, not because of political issue, of course, because of political issue, but they also were just camping, coming out with families. It was like a movement. Now I thought, how could be the politics, or how could politics look like in 21st century? And I realized that it has to be like a service, like an Uber, where you lower the entry point, where you make politics accessible for everybody. What do I mean by that? So, and this is the concept. So now you have politics in order to join the political career or movement. You have to have I don't know, like party affiliation. You have to have money to organize or to hire campaigns or consultants. So not everybody can afford it, and that's how the politics became like a bohemian club, like exclusive club that just few people can join. Now, how can you scale and make it possible for so many or as many as possible people to join politics in order to make the competition?
No, I'm concerned that we have lost Vitali. I'm not sure if he'll be coming back, unfortunately. But he raises an interesting question that I think I'm actually going to, we've gotten a bunch of questions on a similar topic, right? So I think Vitali was trying to tell us that that you can lower the barriers to entry for participation in politics. And in particular, that there's sort of digital tools you can use to do that. And this is something that I think is kind of a mixed bag more generally. For instance, there are these digital tools that allow more people to participate in politics, and we've certainly seen that with the Obama campaign and the Sanders campaign. And those tools should be able to transfer to other contexts and sort of simplify organizing or sort of reduce the sort of friction or amount of resources you need to participate. But at the same time, digital tools can do other things. Oh, Vitali, are you back?
Yeah, I'm back. At which point did you lose me?
So
I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah. So unfortunately, we lost you just as you were starting to say. You were talking about how you're using sort of digital tools to lower the barrier to entry. And I'd love to hear really specifically about what happened in this most recent, the municipal elections in Moscow.
Yeah.
What were you guys doing there?
Bear with me. I know I started really far away. I just tried to explain the whole context. So how this idea was born. So and the problem in Russia is not only it's hard to run for office, not only you don't have democratic institutions, not only you have a powerful Kremlin to fight against, not only you have all this barrier, but you also have this disbelief, this I don't know, disengagement from people that just tired and don't believe it's possible, because all these barriers are so high. Kremlin is powerful, money so many people don't have, campaign they don't know how to run. So and with this concept in mind, like how can you lower the verge, the entry point in politics to be not just like have political affiliation or a lot of money as an entry point, but like just great ideas. Just like how can you make simplified politics accessible and cheap, like affordable, not cheap, affordable. So, and we came up with the idea to create a software, a concept where you can run simultaneously a lot of campaigns, and that led to a great result that never been seen in Russia and I believe worldwide. So get it, we ran in a really authoritarian regime, 1,000 campaigns, exactly 1,017 campaigns simultaneously within 4 weeks, and without any support of government. Actually, everything crowdfunded, everything run by our software. And guess what? We won 267 seats. 267 seats in just Moscow alone. Not only that, we won seats in the districts where the Kremlin is located, like where Putin voted the very same day. So basically, we won in these two districts, main center of Kremlin, of Moscow, of Russia. Really symbolic. We won all seats. So it's like a slap in the face of a government with just a little bit of Uberization and great ideas and technology. So, the second point, or the second great story about our success, is that every single candidate, not unlike in the United States, that the campaign can cost like millions of dollars. Every single candidate costs our campaign just $2 per day. This is great. This is Uber. This is the technology. This is the resistance, and this is a different movement. How you bring politics, even in the countries like Russia. And it showed that over 25% of all possible seats we won within 4 weeks.
It strikes me as quite an amazing result in such a short time, and I think it'll be quite inspiring to people listening who are working in sort of contexts that are similar, where there seems to be so much power on the other side. But I want to talk to you specifically about we've gotten some questions coming in about the role of sort of digital communications and sort of the changing media structure. But so Vitali, I want to ask you about that. We've got some questions asking, for instance, how can we achieve results in situations where everything in the media is closed off to dissenting voices? That's Malaya from South Africa. Mauna from Tunisia has asked us, how do you campaign in such hostile environments when your digital space is under control? Where should you go, right? And Ted in the United States asks, what are some good ways to share information or build networks, even inside borders, when digital communications are so insecure and easy to monitor? And so before we get to the details of sort of how you feel about sort of using these kinds of tools in a place where there's a relatively high amount of government control, I want to talk to Steve for a minute about whether there's any sort of consensus or academic perspective on whether digital tools in general necessarily help sort of resistance or democracy movements, or whether they can be a tool for state control.
I think we're now pretty clear that they can be both. And there's, as we were talking earlier, there was initially a couple of decades ago a certain amount of optimism that new technologies could really sort of tip the balance away from authoritarian regimes towards opposition by allowing opposition to diffuse information, to coordinate, to act collectively much more easily than in the past. And that is true to a degree. I mean, the access to information is extremely important. But we now know that, one, authoritarian regimes can catch up to oppositions and learn how to control it, and often use technology to their own advantage. And the Chinese are really the Chinese communist regime is at the forefront of that. So, like most technologies, the results are mixed, and they're not. I think the consensus, if there is one, is that the new technology does not overwhelmingly favor democratic oppositions. It offers some advantages, but also provides new tools to autocrats. And there's also, to add one thing, there's one danger of relying too much on information technology, is that when you use it as a substitute for human organization, you can actually erode or invest insufficiently in good old-fashioned organization. I mean, societies have overthrown dictators for a very long time. Societies in the past have shown that you can overthrow dictators without Facebook and without iPhones. And the most robust and in the long run democratizing way of organizing opposition is through human communication, a human collective action. And I don't think there is a substitute. So technology can complement that, can facilitate that, but it should never substitute for actual human beings working together, talking together, and acting together in the streets.
Maria, I want to bring you in on this, just because, sort of talking about the long history of how groups have organized themselves to overthrow non-democratic regimes, and this is, of course, the subject of a lot of your work. So, talk to me a little bit, particularly about a strong thread in your work has been that that if you're opposing an autocratic regime, it's not just a good idea or a moral idea, but a strategic idea to use nonviolent resistance. And I think that fits in with some of the things that Steve was saying about building building coalitions between people. And so I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that, because the cynic among us might say that it sounds good in principle in their context where that might work, but come on, at the end of the day, you know, a lot of times you got to throw them over, you know, you got to get some guns or something if you want to really overthrow a dictator, right? So talk about that for me a little bit.
Well, no, I mean, first and foremost, the research that I've conducted on civil resistance has not come at it from a moral or ethical or pacifist perspective at all. I'm not personally a pacifist, so my main interest as someone who's coming out of the security studies field is, you know, which type of resistance historically has been the most effective against the most formidable of opponents. So that was kind of the gist of the research that I conducted with Erica Chenoweth a few years ago, when we collected data on 323 violent and nonviolent campaigns from 1900 to 2006. And these were so-called maximalist political campaigns that were targeting incumbent regimes, so mostly dictatorships and authoritarian regimes, and they were campaigns for territorial secession and self-determination. So tough cases. And we asked the fundamental question, which form of resistance has been most effective at allowing the group to achieve their goals? And the, you know, somewhat surprising for many people finding of the research was that nonviolent resistance, which is a method of prosecuting conflict using, you know, extra institutional tactics like boycotts, strikes, civil disobedience, vigils, satire, street theater, all these direct action tactics, that this form of resistance has been twice as effective historically as armed resistance. So the nonviolent resistance—
Twice as effective.
Right. They succeeded about 53% of the time compared to 26% of the time for armed insurgencies. And that finding has held almost identical up to the present, because Erica certainly Chenoweth has kept the data updated, you know, through to at least 2015. So yeah, so nonviolent resistance has historically been a remarkably effective form of resistance, even against the most repressive, brutal opponents.
Vitali, I want to bring you in to talk about this, because obviously an electoral approach, I think, is intrinsically a nonviolent one, at least one would hope. And I specifically wanted to ask you that we've gotten another question from the audience about how to think about risk, because I think that many of us would wonder if what you're doing is risky, and how do you manage that, or how do you organize your volunteers to sort of confront those challenges?
Well, I want to go back to the questions from our listeners. So all what I said about technology was just a trial to explain the environment and the politics, as usual, how it works in big countries, in small countries, authoritarian and not authoritarian countries. You have the same problem, very same problem in the United States as well. You have two-party system and high entry level, but all technology, as my colleague said, doesn't substitute the grassroots work. So what I said, and the biggest part of our success in Russia was not just technology, it was door-to-door campaign. Now, you can, with right technology, right approach, with right tools, manage the door-to-door campaign and like real talk to people more effectively. You can scale a lot. Instead of running one campaign, you can scale with technology, with bots, with a lot of new technology, from one campaign to 1,000 campaigns. This is the point of technology. But still, the right way to fight, the right way to bring the right message to the people is personal story. It's personal contact. It's personal communication, and it doesn't matter how high the budget is. It doesn't matter where you campaign in the United States or in Africa. It doesn't matter if you have internet there or not. So you have to start with that work. The point is, if you campaign in a big scale, you just add this technology, and then you have bigger success. That's it.
So tell me a little bit about, so a lot of people are concerned about using online technologies because of the risk of sort of state observation or state interference. Is that something that you've faced or thought about? Talk a little bit about that.
I have to admit, and during the whole campaign, having over 20,000 volunteers, having a lot of fundraising activity, everything, I didn't send one single email, nothing. I just used Telegram. So it's the only messenger that it's still encrypted, really safe, and we face these problems on a daily basis in Russia because everything get hacked here by Kremlin. We get spied on, but the Telegram and to build the communication within a messenger is unbelievably effective and unbelievably secure and unbelievably quick. Because
I think
no
that
matter
will probably
how good,
go
just
on.
one more sentence. No matter how good you are in security issues, you're gonna have in the team of 100, 200 people someone who's gonna be a little bit more or less advanced or like more sloppy about it, and there you go, you can hack the whole big system, like what happened to Hillary's campaign. Even big professionals can make mistakes. So you have to create one environment when one person is in charge of the whole security, and the rest can just join this environment. That's it. And I'm sorry,
so we have some questions coming in about one particular question about whether, and I don't know if you experienced this, Vitali, this will be your last question because I know you have to get on your flight, but if you had any experience of people using digital tools and campaigns to attack progressive activists, which Rodrigo from Brazil says is a common problem where he's been working. Vitali, do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah. Say it again. I lost you for a second. I lost the second part of the question. I'm sorry.
Oh, so Rodrigo from Brazil has been working working on combating authoritarian candidates, but that he says that digital tools there have been used to attack progressive activists, and he's wondering if you had any experience of that in your work.
Well, sure. The whole world is not one-sided. So, like, your opponents using digital tools as well. You have to be smart about. Of course, you cannot make digital tools just accessible for one side. That's how you create unbalanced ecosystem. That's how you create totalitarian regimes. So it doesn't matter if it's politics or technology. So you have to have the equal access. And from this point of view, you have to face the fact that your opponents and the government using the same tools. Now, the question is not the tools. Once again, the question is the message. The question is the approach. If you campaign in order just to win the seats, if you campaign in order just to represent your party, versus if you campaign to get people represented and you get people involved in politics, real people. So I'll give you an example. You can send volunteers to a house XYZ with one message, or you can decentralize with a system like we did, your entire network, and make every single household a campaign headquarters. That nobody has to come to an office. Everybody can walk and campaign in the neighborhood because all people know this person there and gonna be more receiving the message than some unknown person knocking the door. So if you empower people without having centralized system like classical campaign management and classical campaign office, I believe you can scale unbelievably, and you just have to trust people and have to teach them how to use it. And this is the biggest problem. How can you teach thousands of people around the country? And that's where technology came in. That's where we created one ecosystem where everybody could do the same, like a game, like a quest. And it's really easy. So many people around the globe play the same game. So just approach the political campaign as a game where everybody can access from around the world remotely, or from the whole country remotely, from every place of a country. And there you go. You solve the problem. That's exactly what we did.
Thank you, Vitali, and thank you for taking the time. I know you are in transit, so we appreciate it.
If I'm going to miss this plane, I'll be with you back in 10 minutes.
Well, thank you very much. Have a good day, my friend. Maria, I was wondering if I could go to you. We've got a question that's kind of in your lane here. Maria, in your book, you note that nonviolent approaches can have the advantage of being able to bring in more supporters, right? That there's you can build a broader coalition that way. So Branislava has a question about that. She says, to achieve change, sometimes you need to create unsavory alliances. For instance, with the police, the military, church, or people who are part of the dictatorship. How do you negotiate and even compromise while keeping the belief in the end goal strong among people in your movement and not be seen as a sellout? So, Maria, do you have sort of comments on that?
Sure. Well, first and foremost, on the point of participation, you know, the reason civil resistance has been strategically so much more effective than armed struggle is that nonviolent campaigns on average attract so many more participants. So participation is probably the single most important variable in determining the success or failure of campaigns. So that sort of builds on a little bit of what Vitali was saying. So being able to attract a lot of people from diverse segments of society is the best guarantor of success, if you will. And, you know, the thing about movements is that you're bringing in different people from different parts of society, often strange bedfellows, in order to achieve shared goals. And oftentimes, whether it's religious figures, whether it's, you know, corporate executives, whether it's, you know, foot soldiers and police, the goal is to attract and win over their support, or at least to, if they're security forces, for example, you want to mute their repression. So how do you, you know, fraternize with police and security forces so that they don't use violent force to respond to protesters, for example? So a lot of campaigns have developed very specific tactics and techniques to be able to, if not win over people from, say, the security forces, to at least discourage them from using violence. But when it comes to coalition building, negotiations are essential. You have to be able to negotiate, organize people around shared goals, you know, whether it's addressing corruption, which is often where the corporate community comes together with grassroots activists, because corruption harms the bottom line and it obviously is stealing from people. So a lot of very interesting historical anti-corruption campaigns have involved, you know, grassroots communities coming together with business leaders, coming together with religious figures and the like. And so that's kind of a common occurrence. Where the sellout critique comes in is if negotiations are kind of used ad hoc. They're not used as part of an overarching popular resistance strategy. You know, so if from the outset, negotiations, coalition building is seen as an essential part of building a strong, diverse movement, then it's easier to explain negotiations. And if negotiations are used to achieve concessions from a regime, for example, you know, if it's, whether it's releasing political prisoners, whether it's, you know, putting forward certain legislation, you know, you often need negotiations to consolidate those small victories and to win concessions. So I think the best answer around the cop-out, you know, sellout critique is, you know, explaining dialogue and negotiations in the context of a wider political struggle that involves, you know, these types of tactics and techniques.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Can I have another
Steve,
cut at that?
I'm going to send my last question to you, if I can. This is from, let me see here. Eve in the Netherlands has asked, what happens after the resistance against authoritarianism? What is the role of the movement that created the resistance initially in the rebuilding of new structures? And so I know, Steve, that this has played out in many different ways in different countries, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit first about how that worked in Latin America, and maybe then talk more generally about, you know, do the institutions that get set up in the revolutionary period get locked in?
Oh, nothing's ever locked in. Let me start though by picking up on the question that was discussed before, and I agree with Maria's points. But to take that a step further, those unsavory characters in the military or allies of the old regime that one doesn't want to dirty one's hands talking to or aligning with, the only way you bring down dictatorships is when they split. The only way, particularly if you're not using arms, and I agree completely with Maria that a nonviolent resistance strategy works far more frequently at bringing down dictatorships. The only way to bring down an authoritarian regime is to split it, to divide it. It's when regimes begin to break up, when military, police, other unsavory characters defect from the regime and join the opposition, that's when authoritarian regimes fall. So if the first step towards democracy is destroying the old authoritarian regime, bringing the old regime down, and to do that, you need to pull apart some of the officials from the old regime. So that's to me a very good argument for talking to and working with, in many cases, fairly unsavory characters from the old regime. Now, so the new coalition that comes to power is almost always a very, very heterogeneous group, a very diverse group that in some cases agrees on nothing except the fact that they opposed the old regime. And those coalitions often do break up pretty quickly, whether it's Poland or Czech Republic or a number of cases in Latin America. Very, very often within a year or 2 or 3 years, this wonderful coalition this heroic coalition that defeated the old authoritarian regime has broken apart into 2, 3, 5, 10 pieces, and sometimes is unrecognizable, like Solidarity in Poland. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It's to some degree it's inevitable. To some degree it's a sign of success when the old coalition can break up and compete against each other, whether it's on left-right issues or social issues, other issues. That means that democratization has worked. So it's pretty common that the coalition, the old opposition coalition, it does not become a new single governing coalition. It's only cases of long-term, serious struggles against an authoritarian regime, like in South Africa, where you get a sort of a single party that holds it together for quite a while after the transition. That's pretty rare.
And you're saying not necessary or even necessarily a good thing. I think that there are a couple of points here that I think maybe run counter to some of the popular understanding. First of all, this idea that nonviolent protests are strategically the better approach. Secondly, this idea that the dividing up of the democratic forces once they come to power is a good sign, I think is really interesting. And then third, this point about the necessity of sort of dividing the sort of authoritarian regime by sort of pulling some members out, even if that means building coalitions across your sort of natural preferences. I think those are all fascinating points, and I think will be really appreciated by our listeners. I want to end on time, even if we didn't manage to start on time. So I'm just going to thank you guys very much for joining us, and thank Aprajita and the intrepid crew over at MobLab who overcame what I think they actually built an entirely new internet so that we could do this. So I appreciate them all very much, and thank you all for your time.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Okay. I'll just take a minute before we stop the broadcast. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Maria, Vanessa, and Vitali, who's not there. Thank you so much. It was a wonderful discussion. I would just close the session by announcing our next MobLab Live, which will happen in late November on the topic of building effective campaign narratives through social science. So stay tuned, follow us, and we will keep you posted on the exact date and time. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you, Aprajita.
Thank you.